Hello there, and welcome to Silent Souls. I see most of you are watching but not subscribing. Come on, hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to comment below where you're watching from. I'd love to know. Tonight, we leave the open road and ascend into the realm of the modern cathedral, the airport. A city within a city, a place of perpetual transition where thousands of stories converge and diverge under the same vaulted roof. By day, it is a monument to human connection and engineering. But in the deep, quiet hours of the night, when the last flight has departed and the corridors fall silent, it becomes something else entirely. A vast, echoing labyrinth where the boundaries between here and there, now and then, grow thin. Settle in as we explore the most quietly unsettling true stories from the world of airports. The life of an airport cleaner is a life of reversed polarity. While the world sleeps, they are awake. While the great halls lie silent and empty, they are at their most busy. For Sarah, this inverted existence had become a second nature, a rhythm as familiar as her own heartbeat. For nearly a decade, she had been a nocturnal custodian of one of Europe's largest and busiest hubs. A sprawling city of glass, steel, and endless polished floors, known officially as Intercontinental Airport Frankfurt-Hahn, but known to its night staff simply as the Cathedral. Her domain was Terminal B, the oldest of the three terminals, a testament to an architectural era of brutalist concrete and faint, lingering hope. By day, it was a river of humanity, a chaotic symphony of rolling suitcases, boarding calls, and the frantic energy of 1,000 simultaneous journeys. But after the last flight departed just past midnight, a profound and heavy silence would descend. A silence so complete it felt like a physical substance, like wading through deep water. Sarah was a woman built for this silence. In her late 40s, with strong, capable hands and a face that was more thoughtful than weary, she found a strange peace in the emptiness. Her work was one of restoration. She would arrive to a landscape of chaos, discarded boarding passes, crushed coffee cups, the grime of 10,000 footsteps, and through a methodical, almost meditative process of mopping, wiping, and polishing, she would return it to a state of pristine order. It was a satisfying, tangible result in a world that often felt abstract and transient. She knew Terminal B intimately. She knew which tiles in the main concourse had a faint, almost musical chime when her cart passed over them. She knew the specific low hum emitted by the frozen yogurt machine in the shuttered food court. She knew the drafts, the way the cold night air would seep through a poorly sealed window near the international gates, creating a pocket of winter in the middle of the climate-controlled summer. And she knew the history, the stories whispered by the older staff in the break room. She knew, for instance, about Gate B-17. Gate B-17 was a ghost. Tucked away at the very end of a long, dimly lit concourse, it was a relic of a bygone airline, Aerolux, which had gone spectacularly bankrupt over 15 years ago. The gate had never been repurposed. Its large backlit departure board was a permanent dark void. The rows of connected seats, once a vibrant if garish orange, were now faded and dust-shrouded. The carpet leading to it was a time capsule of 1970s design, a pattern of swirling browns and ochres, worn thin by footsteps that had long since ceased. A faint, metallic tang of disuse hung in the air around it, and the jet bridge had been permanently retracted and sealed. Its accordion-pleated shroud, a blind eye, turned to the empty tarmac outside. Most of the night staff gave it a wide berth, not out of fear, but out of a vague sense of melancholy. It was a place of failure, a dead branch on the tree of global travel. Sarah, however, felt no such aversion. To her, it was simply part of her route, a quiet corner that required less frequent cleaning but still demanded attention. She would dutifully sweep the dust from its floors, wipe the grime from its silent counter, and move on. It was just another part of the cathedral, a quiet chapel in a vast sleeping church. The anomaly began on a Tuesday, or rather, in the early hours of a Wednesday. It was 3:47 a.m. This precise time would later etch itself into her memory. She was polishing the brass handrails near the entrance to the B-Gates concourse, the sharp, clean scent of her polish cutting through the stale, recirculated air. The only sounds were the whisper of her cloth, the distant, rhythmic clunk of a baggage cart being moved somewhere deep in the bowels of the terminal, and the ever-present subliminal hum of the building itself. Then, a sound that did not belong. It was the crisp, electric click hiss of the public address system powering on. This in itself was not unusual. Automated announcements for cleaning crews or security updates occasionally broke the silence. But this was different. It came not from the main concourse speakers, but from a specific localized cluster of them. The one serving the distant dead-end corridor where Gate B-17 resided. A voice followed the click. It was a woman's voice, calm, professional, and crystal clear, yet possessing a strange, flat quality, as if it had been recorded in a soundproof room. There was no echo in the vast space, a physical impossibility that Sarah's brain registered but did not immediately process. Ladies and gentlemen, Aerolux Airlines announces the final boarding call for Flight AL-280 non-stop service to Budapest. All remaining passengers are requested to proceed immediately to Gate B-17. This is the final boarding call for Flight AL-280 to Budapest. Sarah froze, her cloth suspended in mid-air. Every hair on her arm stood erect. The words were wrong. The airline was wrong. The destination was wrong. Budapest was served from Terminal A by a modern carrier. Aerolux was a corporate corpse. And the gate was a tomb. A cold knot tightened in her stomach, a primal reaction to a fundamental rewriting of her reality. Her first rational thought was of a prank. A bored security guard with a twisted sense of humor, perhaps, or a tech-savvy cleaner who had found a way to access the old PA panel. But the voice, it held an authority, a sterile perfection that felt beyond a prankster's abilities. She stood still for a full minute, listening. The silence returned, deeper and more profound than before. The announcement had violated it, and its absence now felt charged, expectant. Driven by a mixture of professional duty and a deep, unsettling curiosity, she made a decision. She would go and see. Leaving her cart, she walked down the long concourse. Her footsteps, usually quiet, seemed to explode in the cavernous space. The lights were in their nighttime mode, every third fixture turned off, creating pools of shadow that stretched between islands of dim, jaundiced light. As she approached the final stretch, the air grew colder. It was the familiar draft from the faulty window, but tonight it felt sharper, more aggressive, carrying with it the faint, sweet and sour scent of old perfume and of ozone, like the air after a lightning strike. She turned the final corner, and there she saw it. Gate B-17 was no longer dark. The departure board above the counter, dead for 15 years, was glowing with a soft greenish light. The text was not the modern, pixel-perfect font of the current system, but the blocky, slightly blurred characters of an ancient dot matrix display. Aerolux Flight 280 Budapest, final boarding gate, B-17. And behind the counter stood a woman. She was dressed in a vintage Aerolux uniform, a sharp navy blue jacket with severe epaulets, a pencil skirt, and a neat winged cap perched on her head of perfectly coiffed dark hair. Her posture was ramrod straight, her hands clasped neatly in front of her. Her face was turned slightly away, but Sarah could see the profile of a sharp jawline and a placid professional smile. The sight was so impossible, so visually dissonant, that Sarah's mind simply refused to process it. It was like seeing a black and white photograph suddenly step out of its frame. The figure was utterly still, a mannequin in a museum display. But the air around her shimmered, a heat haze distortion that made the faded orange seats behind her seem to waver. Sarah stood frozen, perhaps 10 meters away, hidden in the shadow of a support column. Her breath caught in her throat. This was no prank. This was something else. Something that should not be. Then, the figure moved. It was a small, graceful gesture. The gate agent, for that was what she was or had been, turned her head. Her eyes, dark and depthless, met Sarah's. The professional smile never wavered. It was not a friendly smile, nor was it threatening. It was a mask, empty of all human emotion, a programmed response. She lifted one hand, her gesture slow and deliberate, and extended it, palm up, towards the sealed entrance of the jet bridge. The meaning was unmistakable. "Your flight is ready. Please proceed." A wave of irrational compulsion washed over Sarah. It was a powerful, visceral pull, a deep-seated instinct to obey, to present a boarding pass, to walk down that jet bridge and take her seat. Her feet felt leaden, yet they itched to step forward. The thought was seductive in its simplicity. Just go. Get on the plane. Your journey is waiting. She found her hand twitching, patting the pocket of her cleaner's smock for a ticket that did not exist. It was that absurd physical action that broke the spell. The sheer wrongness of it, a cleaner in a stained uniform, boarding a phantom flight to a city she had no desire to visit, jolted her back to reality. This was not her journey. This was not her time. She took a sharp step backward, shaking her head, a frantic, silent refusal. The gate agent's smile did not change. Her outstretched hand did not drop. But something in her eyes, the void within them, seemed to deepen, to intensify. The air grew colder still, the scent of ozone now overpowering, stinging Sarah's nostrils. The PA system click-hissed again, right above her head, making her jump. "Final passenger for flight AL-280, you are holding the departure. Please proceed to gate B-17 immediately." The voice was the same, but now it felt personal. It was directed at her. Terror, pure and undiluted, finally overrode her shock. She turned and ran. She did not look back. She ran past her abandoned cleaning cart, her footsteps echoing like gunshots in the terminal, not stopping until she was back in the bright, modern and blessedly normal light of the main concourse. She collapsed onto a bench, her heart hammering against her ribs, her breath coming in ragged gasps. When she had calmed enough to think, she went to the security office. The night guard, a man named Klaus whom she knew well, listened to her fractured story with a patient, skeptical expression. "Sarah, it was probably a dream," he said, not unkindly. "You were tired. You fell asleep for a moment by your cart. This happens." "It wasn't a dream," she insisted, her voice trembling. "The board was on. The announcement. Check the log." Klaus humored her. He pulled up the PA system log on his computer. He scrolled through the timestamps. 3:45 a.m., a reminder for crew to clear security. 4:00 a.m., a test of the fire alarm system in Terminal C. There was nothing at 3:47 a.m. No record of any announcement from the B gates concourse, let alone for a defunct airline and a non-existent flight. "See?" Klaus said, gesturing at the screen. "Nothing. Your mind was playing tricks on you. The old gate, it gives people the creeps. It's just a story." Defeated and deeply shaken, Sarah returned to her cart. She did not go back to the B gates concourse that night. She finished her shift in a daze. The image of the smiling agent and the glowing board burned into her mind. The next night, and every night after, she avoided gate B-17. She would clean right up to the entrance of its corridor, but she would not set foot down it. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she would hear it again. The click hiss, the calm, professional voice making its final call for a flight that would never leave, for passengers who would never come. She never saw the agent again. But she understood, on a level deeper than rational thought, what she had witnessed. It wasn't a ghost in the traditional mournful sense. It was an echo, a persistent, automated recording of a moment in time, a routine procedure that had been so perfectly, professionally executed day after day that its energy had been seared into the very location. The gate agent wasn't a lost soul. She was a fossilized habit, a function without a purpose, forever performing its duty in a vacuum, waiting for a passenger list that was eternally delayed. The horror was not in a malevolent presence, but in the perfect, sterile emptiness of it. The smiling face with nothing behind it, the welcoming gesture leading to a void. It was a system stuck in an endless loop, a destination with no journey, a departure with no arrival. And in the deepest, most silent hour of the night, in the cathedral of travel, that empty ritual would play out, a silent, desperate pantomime for an audience of one, a reminder that some check-ins are forever, and some gates never truly close. Leo's world was one of weight and balance, of tangible forces and predictable outcomes. For 23 years, he had been a baggage handler at San Francisco International Airport, a man who spoke the language of container bins, loadmasters, and transfer carts. His was a career built in the liminal space between the glamour of flight and the gritty reality of logistics, a world of roaring engines, hydraulics, and the ever-present biting wind of the tarmac. By day, he was part of a well-oiled machine, a cog in the great global mechanism of travel. But the overnight shift, the graveyard, was a different beast. It was a time of shadows and silence, where the massive hangars felt like cathedral naves and the isolated work lights cast long, dancing skeletons of the ground equipment. He was a man built for this work, solid, steadfast, with a face weathered by 1,000 bay winds and hands that were a roadmap of nicks, calluses, and faded scars. He found a profound, almost spiritual satisfaction in the precise geometry of loading a Boeing 777's cargo hold, in the careful balance of weight that meant the difference between a smooth flight and a crisis. He trusted in the physical. A bag had a weight, a dimension, a barcode. It was a problem to be solved, a piece of a puzzle to be slotted into its correct place. The supernatural had no place in his universe. It was an illogical concept, as nonsensical as a silent jet engine or a weightless suitcase. The incident occurred during the deepest trough of the night, the hours between 2 and 4 a.m., when the airport's pulse was at its faintest. The last red-eye to Tokyo had departed, the first wave of early morning flights was still hours away, and an eerie operational silence had fallen over the international arrivals hall. Leo was on a break, sipping bitter vending machine coffee from a styrofoam cup, sitting on an overturned utility cart, and staring out at the vast empty space. The hall was a monument to anticipation, a cavern designed for the joyful chaos of reunions that was now utterly still. The massive information boards were dark. The currency exchange booths were shuttered behind steel grates, and the rows of rental car counters were lifeless. His gaze drifted, as it often did during these quiet moments, to the baggage carousels. There were 12 of them, massive oval tracks of polished steel, silent and dormant like sleeping serpents. All except one. Carousel 13. It was a piece of airport lore, a subject of dark humor and mild superstition among the ground crew. It had been decommissioned years before Leo's time, after a terminal renovation had rendered it obsolete. Unlike the other carousels, it hadn't been removed. It simply sat there, at the far end of the hall, disconnected from the baggage handling system, its power conduits severed and capped. Its surface was slightly duller than the others, a fine layer of undisturbed dust visible under the dimmed emergency lighting. A few out-of-service signs, faded with age, were taped to its metal sides. The story went that it had been the site of a minor but bizarre incident in the 1980s, a single unclaimed suitcase that had circulated for 3 days straight, containing nothing but a single pristine white feather, and had been shut down more for superstitious reasons than practical ones. As Leo watched, Carousel 13 shuddered. It was a deep, mechanical groan that had no right to exist, a sound of sheared metal and protesting motors that had been silent for decades. A single weak fluorescent tube above it flickered to life, buzzing erratically and casting a sickly, strobing light over the dusty belt. Leo froze, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. Impossible, his mind stated flatly. It was not connected. It had no power. It was a relic. The groaning intensified, and then, with a jarring lurch, the carousel began to turn. The movement was slow, jerky, and unnerving, the sound of a corpse being dragged across gravel. It was a pantomime of function, a dead thing pretending to be alive. A cold dread, entirely separate from the chill of the air-conditioned hall, began to seep into Leo's bones. This wasn't a mechanical fault. This was a violation of natural law. He stood up, his training overriding his fear. A malfunctioning piece of equipment, even a dead one, was a hazard. It had to be reported. He was about to turn and head for the operations office when the first item appeared. It didn't emerge from the rubber flaps that normally led from the baggage handling system. It simply materialized on the turning belt, as if conjured from the dust motes dancing in the erratic light. It was a child's shoe, a single small red sneaker caked in dried dark mud. It was scuffed and worn, the lace broken. It lay on its side, looking impossibly small and forlorn on the vast, empty belt. Leo stared, his rational mind scrambling for an explanation. A prank? Had some kid thrown it? But the carousel was too high, too far from the public area, and the way it had just appeared. The carousel continued its slow, groaning rotation. As the shoe completed its first circuit and passed out of his immediate line of sight, a second item manifested. A book, a hardcover, its jacket missing, its pages swollen and warped as if from prolonged immersion in water. It was splayed open, its text blurred into illegible Rorschach blots of ink. Then a third. A man's wedding ring, simple and gold, tied to a piece of frayed common twine. The knot was tight, complex, the work of frantic, fumbling fingers. Fourth, a passport. Its blue cover was bleached and peeling, the eagle emblem barely visible. He couldn't see the country from where he stood, but it had a ghostly, anachronistic quality. A fifth, a pair of round, wire-rimmed spectacles, one lens starred with a spiderweb of cracks. They were not arriving. They were accumulating. With each slow, agonizing rotation of the carousel, a new item would blink into existence, adding to a growing, silent tableau of loss. There were no suitcases, no bags, just these raw, intimate, and heartbreaking artifacts. They were not being delivered, they were being presented. Driven by a morbid professional curiosity that now felt like a compulsion, Leo walked closer. The air around Carousel 13 was frigid, a deep, penetrating cold that made his skin prickle. It was the cold of a deep cellar, of a place the sun had never touched. And there was a sound, a low, almost subaudible hum that was not mechanical, but which seemed to vibrate in the fillings of his teeth. It was a frequency of pure sorrow. He stopped at the edge of the belt, watching the items parade past him. The mud-stained shoe, the waterlogged book, the ring on a string, the ruined passport, the broken glasses, now a porcelain doll with a cracked face, a single silk evening glove, a dented canteen. He reached out, his handler's instinct to identify and sort taking over. His fingers brushed against the gold wedding ring as it passed. The cold that shot up his arm was electric, a jolt of absolute zero that was more than physical. It was a blast of pure, distilled emotion. He didn't just feel the cold. He felt a crushing wave of despair, of finality, of a love severed so abruptly it had left a permanent scream frozen in time. He saw in a flash that was not sight, a man's hand, desperately tying a knot, a promise made in the face of oblivion. He felt the terror, the resignation. He snatched his hand back as if burned, his heart hammering. He stared at his tingling fingers. The items weren't just cold. They were saturated. They were psychic sponges, soaked through with the final, cataclysmic moments of their owners. He looked at the waterlogged book and felt the blind, disorienting panic of drowning. He looked at the child's shoe and felt the sharp, confused terror of a small being separated from everything safe and known. He looked at the broken glasses and felt the shattering of a world, the moment a universe of detail and clarity was obliterated into pain and blur. This was not a baggage carousel. It was a gut-wrenching, open-air museum of tragedy, a gallery of final moments. Each item was a headstone for a story that had ended in chaos and loss. The carousel continued its macabre parade for what felt like an eternity, though his watch told him only 13 minutes had passed. It disgorged a final item, a pilot's logbook, its pages filled with neat, precise entries that stopped abruptly halfway down a page. Then, with a final shuddering groan, it slowed and stopped. The fluorescent light above it flickered, buzzed, and died. The silence that returned was absolute. The hum was gone. The cold began to slowly recede, though a core of it remained deep in Leo's chest. He stood there, trembling, surrounded by the ghostly artifacts of dozens of lives shattered. He was a man who dealt in systems and solutions, and here was a problem with no solution, a loss that could not be rectified. There were no tags to scan, no manifests to consult, no lost and found bin deep enough to hold this kind of sorrow. He didn't touch anything else. He walked away on unsteady legs, back to the bright, harsh fluorescence of the operations office. He reported a mechanical fault, with a decommissioned carousel, his voice a monotone. A maintenance crew was dispatched, found nothing powered, and shrugged it off as a glitch in the building's ancient electrical grid. The next morning, the items were gone. The carousel was once again just a dusty, silent relic. When Leo mentioned the objects to the day shift lost and found clerk, he was met with a blank stare. Nothing had been turned in. He never spoke of the emotional onslaught, the visions, the cold. Those were his alone to carry. But he understood. Carousel 13 was not part of the airport's physical baggage system. It was a part of its emotional one. It was a drain, a spillway for the immense accumulated grief of travel. The crashes, the disappearances, the personal tragedies that had unfolded within the airport's walls, or were connected to it. When the pressure of that unseen sorrow grew too great, the carousel would briefly, horrifyingly come to life, offering up its terrible cargo not for reclamation, but for witness. It was a silent, screaming vent for the baggage that never got claimed, the journeys that never reached their end. The stories that were forever interrupted. Leo still works the graveyard shift. He still drinks his bad coffee and stares out at the silent arrivals hall. But his eyes now skip over Carousel 13, refusing to linger. He has learned that the heaviest baggage has no weight, the most lost items have no tags, and some deliveries are not meant for the living, but are simply echoes, forever circling in the dark, waiting for someone to finally, truly see them. Arthur Pendleton had spent his entire adult life listening to the sky. For 35 years, his world had been the controlled chaos of the air traffic control tower at a major East Coast international airport. A glass-walled nerve center perched high above the tarmac, a realm of radar scopes, crackling headsets, and the immense quiet responsibility for thousands of lives suspended in the air. His voice, calm and precise, had been a beacon in the storm, a point of absolute certainty for pilots navigating turbulence, fog, and mechanical fear. He had been a shepherd of metal birds, a master of the intricate, invisible dance of approach paths, holding patterns and final vectors. Retirement had been a form of grounding, a sudden, deafening silence. The world at sea level felt slow, muffled, and strangely aimless. To combat the quiet, he had taken a job as a night security guard at the very airport he had once overseen from the clouds. It was a way to remain connected to the rhythm of flight, even if he was now a spectator on the ground. His new domain was not the gleaming modern terminals, but the original airport building, a sprawling Art Deco structure known as the Quiet Wing. The Quiet Wing was the airport's forgotten memory. Decommissioned in the 1980s after a massive expansion, it was now a time capsule, sealed off from the main flow of travel. Its grand hall, with a vaulted ceiling featuring a faded mural of Icarus, was silent. Its ticket counters, made of dark polished wood and pitted brass, stood empty. The seats were thickly padded vinyl in a shade of avocado green that screamed of the 1970s. The air smelled of dust, old paper, and the faint, sweet decay of abandoned places. For the current airport administration, it was a storage area and a problem for future developers. For Arthur, it was a sanctuary. His nightly rounds were a ritual of remembrance. He would walk the concourses, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, illuminating forgotten details. A vintage arrivals board with flip-style numbers, a shuttered bar called the Jet Stream Lounge, a newsstand frozen in time, its magazines still wrapped in yellowing plastic. He knew every squeak in the terrazzo floor, every draft that whispered through a cracked window pane. This was his past, not just the airport's. He had proposed to his late wife Eleanor at Gate 12 in this very wing a lifetime ago. The security office for the Quiet Wing was a small, windowless room tucked behind the old baggage claim. Its equipment was as outdated as its surroundings. The radio was a bulky analog VHF unit, the same model he had used decades ago in the tower. It was meant for communication with the central security office, but the signal in the old building was notoriously poor, often picking up stray transmissions from taxi dispatchers and police bands. Arthur didn't mind. The crackle and hiss were a familiar comfort. The anomaly began subtly. It was a week into the job, during the deep silence of the 2 a.m. hour. He was sipping coffee from his thermos, listening to the radio's empty static, when a voice broke through. It was faint, distorted by distance and interference, but unmistakably a pilot's voice. The tone was calm, professional, but with an underlying strain Arthur recognized instantly, the controlled tension of a developing problem. Tower, this is Seabird 4-2. We're showing a fluctuation on fuel pressure, number 2 engine. Requesting priority landing, over. Arthur sat up straight, his controller's instincts snapping to attention. Seabird wasn't an airline call sign he knew. It sounded military, or perhaps a private charter. He keyed his own mic. Seabird 4-2, this is airport security. You're broadcasting on a ground frequency. State your position and intention, over. There was no response, just a hiss of static. He tried again. Nothing. He shrugged, attributing it to a ghost signal, a conversation from miles away bouncing off the atmosphere into his old radio. It happened, but it happened again the next night, and the night after, always around the same time, always the same voice, the same call sign, Seabird 4-2. The reports grew more urgent. Tower, Seabird 4-2. We've lost number 2. Repeat, engine 2 is out. Feathering prop now. Requesting vectors for immediate landing, over. Seabird 4-2, we're losing altitude. I need that vector now. I've got 23 souls on board. Arthur's blood ran cold. He knew this scenario. It was every controller's nightmare. He'd run the simulations 100 times. A multi-engine aircraft losing one, fighting to maintain control, the desperate race for the runway. He found himself falling back into his old role, his voice dropping into the calm, authoritative cadence he hadn't used in years. Seabird 4-2, this is security. I am monitoring your transmission. You are not on my scope. I repeat, I have no visual or radar. Can you confirm your heading and altitude? Over. Silence. Then a burst of static, and the voice, tighter now, fraying at the edges. Who is this? Where is tower? We're on the ILS for runway 32 left. I see the lights. But the glide slope is... it's erratic. Runway 32. Left. That was the old, decommissioned runway, the one that had been built over to make way for the new terminal expansion. It hadn't been used in over 30 years. A profound dread settled in Arthur's gut. This wasn't a contemporary signal. He was listening to a ghost, a recording or something else, something far more haunting, playing out in real time. He abandoned the office. He had to see. Grabbing his heavy flashlight, he moved quickly through the dark concourses, his footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. He reached the sealed doors that led out to the old observation deck, a concrete balcony that had once offered a panoramic view of the airfield. He used his master key, the lock groaning in protest. He stepped out into the cold night air. The modern airport lay to the south, a galaxy of bright lights and moving aircraft. But before him, where the old runway 32 left should have been, was nothing but the dark, sprawling roof of the new terminal building and a maze of service roads. It was a solid, unbroken landscape of asphalt and concrete. He lifted his portable radio. Seabird 42, this is security on the ground. Look outside. Runway 32. Left does not exist. I repeat, it is not there. You are not where you think you are. Over. The response was immediate, sharp with terror. What are you talking about? I see it. I see the runway lights. I'm on final approach. Gods, we're too low. Pull up. Pull. The transmission dissolved into a scream of tearing metal, a roar of uncontrolled energy, and then a final deafening crash that was so vivid, so horrifically detailed, Arthur flinched, dropping his radio. The sound echoed not in the air around him, but inside his own skull. Then, silence. The absolute, vacuum-like silence of the void. He stood there on the dark observation deck, trembling, the cold seeping into his bones. He knew, with the certainty of a man who had spent a lifetime understanding flight, that he had just witnessed a death. Not a live one, but a death that had happened long ago, its final terrible moments trapped in a loop, a sonic haunt that his old radio and his attuned ears had somehow unlocked. He spent the next day in the airport's administrative archives, a dusty room filled with ledgers and microfiche. He was a man with a mission, driven by a need to give the ghost a name. He searched for accidents, for incidents involving a seabird flight. He found nothing. It was an elderly archivist on her way out the door who provided the final chilling piece. "Seabird," she said, her brow furrowed. That was a call sign used by Aero Atlantic Charter back in the late 70s. They went under after the accident. "What accident?" Arthur asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Flight 424, she said. A Lockheed L-188 Electra. Left from here, headed for Montreal. They lost an engine shortly after takeoff. There was confusion. A miscommunication with the tower. The controller thought they were talking about one runway. The pilot was aiming for another, the old one, 32 left, which was closed for repairs that night. They never saw the construction equipment. They went in just short of the threshold. No survivors. It was a terrible, terrible thing. They decommissioned the runway for good not long after. Arthur returned to the quiet wing that night a changed man. He didn't turn on the radio. He sat in the silence, the weight of the past pressing down on him. He had not been talking to a ghost. He had been the ghost. He had been the controller on the other end of that final, fatal conversation. His predecessor, his counterpart from another era, whose voice was lost to time, but whose terrible, unfolding mistake was now his to share. He was the custodian now in a deeper sense. He was the keeper of this story, the sole witness to this endless crashing loop. The quiet wing was not just a forgotten building. It was a tomb for a moment of catastrophic error, and he was its night watchman, listening forever for the ghost of Seabird 42 on its final doomed approach, a silent witness to a crash that would never, ever end. Chloe's world was a symphony of forgotten things. As a member of the overnight cleaning crew at the sprawling, ultra-modern Singapore Changi Airport, her canvas was the detritus of 100,000 daily journeys. She was a curator of lost moments, her hands wiping away the smudges of goodbyes on terminal windows, her mop sluicing through the grime of hellos tracked across polished floors. At 24, she possessed a quiet empathy, a sensitivity that felt both like a gift and a vulnerability. While others on her team saw only mess, Chloe often felt the faint, lingering emotional resonance of the spaces she cleaned. The frantic energy of a missed connection gate, the drowsy contentment of a corner where a family had finally settled, the sharp, metallic tang of anxiety near the security screening. Her favorite and most complicated assignment was the Enchanted Garden, a children's play area in the heart of Terminal 3. By day, it was a riot of primary colors and joyful noise, a biosphere of shrieking laughter and tiny pounding feet. It was a fantastical space with soft, springy flooring mimicking grass, a winding, low-lit slide shaped like a caterpillar, and giant fabric flowers that swayed gently in the manufactured breeze of the air conditioning. It was designed to be a pressure valve, a place for pent-up youthful energy to be safely discharged before being confined to an aluminum tube for hours. But after midnight, when the last straggling family had been called to their gate, the Enchanted Garden underwent a profound transformation. The cheerful, piped-in sounds of birdsong and bubbling brooks were switched off. The colorful, shifting lights in the caterpillar's body went dark. The silence that descended was not the empty silence of the main concourse. It was a waiting silence. It was the quiet of a stage after the actors have left, the set still vibrant and expectant, holding the ghost of the performance. Chloe's task was to reset this stage, to erase the evidence of the day's play, the sticky handprints on the plastic leaves, the crushed cereal bits ground into the grass, the forgotten sippy cups and tiny socks. She didn't dislike the work. There was a peace to it, a sense of restoring order to a beautiful chaos. But she was always acutely aware that she was not entirely alone. It started with the cold. Not the uniform, climate-controlled chill of the terminal, but specific, localized pockets of cold air. She would be wiping down the curved plastic wall of the caterpillar slide, and her arm would pass through a column of air so frigid it raised goosebumps. It would be gone a second later. She'd feel it again near the top of the slide, or in the little fabric teepee tucked in a corner. These cold spots moved. They were playful almost. Then came the sounds. The first time she heard it, she was on her hands and knees, scrubbing at a particularly stubborn patch of grape jelly. It was a soft, breathy giggle. It came from inside the tunnel of the caterpillar slide. She stopped scrubbing, listening. The terminal was silent. She shrugged, attributing it to the gurgle of a distant floor polisher or the sigh of the air conditioning. A few nights later she heard it again. This time it was accompanied by the faint, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of small, running feet on the springy floor. The sound circled her, a swift, light-footed pattering that seemed to come from just behind the large, stuffed mushroom stools. She spun around, her flashlight beam cutting a swath through the dim, decorative lighting. Nothing. The thumping stopped instantly. A prickle of unease traced its way down her spine. This was new. She began to notice other things. Out of the corner of her eye, she would catch a flicker of movement. A small shadowy form darting behind a fabric flower, a glimpse of a tiny bare foot disappearing around the curve of the slide. It was always in the periphery, a fleeting impression that vanished the moment she focused on it. It was like trying to catch smoke with her bare hands. The feeling of being watched intensified. It wasn't a malevolent stare. It was curious, observant. She felt the way a goldfish might feel when a child taps on its bowl, not threatened, but acutely aware of a presence from another dimension of existence. One night, carrying a bag of trash out of the play area, she felt a distinct, gentle tug on the leg of her coveralls. It was the precise, insistent pull of a small child demanding attention. She looked down. Nothing was there, but the sensation lingered, a phantom pressure on the fabric. That was the night she decided to speak. Her voice was a soft murmur, barely disturbing the heavy silence. "Hello?" she said to the empty play area. "Is someone there?" There was no answer, but the atmosphere shifted. The waiting silence became a listening one. The air itself seemed to still, the few decorative lights seeming to burn a little brighter. She felt a wave of intense, focused attention. "It's okay," she continued, her cleaning rag still in her hand. "You can play. I'm just cleaning up." She went back to work, wiping down the handrails. As she did, she heard the giggle again, closer this time, and then the soft thumping of feet resumed, a little less hesitant now. She didn't look, she just kept cleaning, a small, understanding smile touching her lips. She wasn't afraid. The presence or presences felt lonely, not dangerous. The culmination came on a night when a thick, soupy fog had settled over Singapore, silencing the outside world and making the airport feel like a ghost ship adrift on a silent sea. Chloe was in the enchanted garden, her work almost finished. The play area was spotless, ready for the next day's onslaught of joy. She was about to leave when she saw it. On the inside of a curved plastic porthole window in the caterpillar's side, a small, perfect handprint appeared. It was not made of grime or jelly. It was made of condensation, a fine, delicate misting on the cool surface, as if a warm, living hand had been pressed against it from the inside. It was tiny, the hand of a toddler. Chloe's breath caught in her throat. She watched, mesmerized, as the handprint slowly, gradually, began to fade. It didn't smear or run. It simply evaporated, the tiny lines of the palm and the perfect miniature ovals of the fingertips disappearing over the course of a full minute, until the window was clear once more. In that moment, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The cold spots weren't random. They were the thermal signatures of small, energetic bodies that were no longer there. The giggles and footfalls were not echoes of the day's play, but the residual energy of it, the psychic imprint of countless children who had passed through this space. The enchanted garden wasn't haunted by the ghost of a single, tragic child. It was haunted by the idea of childhood itself within its walls. It was a reservoir of transient joy, a capacitor that stored the pure, uncomplicated energy of play. These were not lost souls. They were echoes. They were the laughter that had soaked into the soft flooring, the shrieks of delight that had been absorbed by the soundproofed walls, the boundless, hopeful energy of 1,000 layovers, all condensed into a form that could only manifest when the space was empty and silent, when the real children were gone. The phantom handprint was not a plea for help. It was a wave goodbye, a final playful interaction from a consciousness made of memory and emotion. From that night on, Chloe's relationship with the enchanted garden changed. She no longer felt a prickle of unease, but a sense of sacred duty. She was not just cleaning a play area, she was tending a sanctuary. She was the keeper of these joyful ghosts, the guardian of this pocket dimension where the spirit of play never had to end. She would often speak to them as she worked, telling them about her day, about the interesting people she'd seen passing through the terminal. Sometimes she would even bring a small, simple toy, a brightly colored ball, a soft block, and leave it in the center of the floor overnight. In the morning, it would always be undisturbed. But she liked to think they appreciated the gesture. She had learned that the most profound hauntings are not always born of tragedy. Sometimes they are born of an emotion so powerful, so pure, that it simply refuses to dissipate. And in the deep, silent heart of the night, in a place built for the most innocent of journeys, that energy would stir. The echoes of countless children would rise to play once more, their laughter a silent, joyful secret in the sleeping airport, forever on a layover, forever at home. For a man like Mr. Al-Jahani, airports were not places of wonder or anxiety. They were intricate systems to be navigated with quiet efficiency. A diplomat for a small, oil-rich Gulf nation for over 40 years, his life had been a study in protocol, in the subtle languages of bureaucracy and border control. His passport, a thick, leather-bound document filled with visas and stamps, was a testament to a lifetime of passage. He knew the precise cadence of a smooth arrival, the deplaning, the brisk walk to immigration, the respectful nod to the officer, the collection of luggage, the transfer to a waiting car. It was a dance he had performed 1,000 times, and he moved through it with the unthinking grace of a seasoned performer. This particular journey, however, had been a symphony of delays. A mechanical issue in Dubai, a missed connection in Frankfurt, and now a late-night arrival into New York's John F. Kennedy Airport. His body ached with a fatigue that was more spiritual than physical. The vibrant chaos of JFK during the day was something he could armor himself against. The silence of its late-night operations was a different beast, a hollowed-out exhaustion that mirrored his own. He disembarked from the Lufthansa A380, one of the last passengers. The jet bridge was empty, the cheerful farewell of the crew echoing in a sterile tunnel. The concourse was a vast, silent canyon. Most of the shops were shuttered behind steel curtains, their vibrant logos dark. The only sounds were the hum of the ventilation and the distant, lonely whir of a floor polisher. The usual river of humanity had dwindled to a trickle of weary, disoriented stragglers. Following the signs for baggage claim and customs, he found himself in the arrivals hall. It was a space designed for anticipation and reunion, but now it felt like an abandoned ballroom. The massive carousels stood still and silent. A few other passengers from his flight stood like lost souls, staring at the blank boards. Mr. Al-Jahani collected his 2 impeccably packed suitcases from the solitary, slowly turning belt. The ritual was complete. Now for the final hurdle, customs. The main customs hall was vast, a forest of stainless steel and polished concrete divided into channels for citizens, non-citizens, and global entry. The overhead signs were dark, the booths were empty, their computer screens black. A single uniformed officer sat on a stool near the exit, looking at his phone, looking profoundly bored. A temporary freestanding sign with an arrow pointed down a side corridor, with the handwritten words, "All arrivals, customs." It was an odd directive, unprofessional, but fatigue bred compliance. With a quiet sigh, Mr. Al-Jahani nodded to the officer who didn't look up and guided his luggage cart in the direction of the arrow. The corridor was different from the rest of the terminal. The lighting was lower, emanating from old yellowish fluorescent tubes that buzzed with a persistent, nagging frequency. The walls were not the bright, modern drywall of the main hall, but an older painted cinder block, the color of tired bone. The air changed too. It lost the sterile, conditioned quality of the terminal and took on a staleness, a flatness, as if it had been breathed and rebreathed for a very long time. It was also noticeably colder. The corridor turned a corner and he saw the line. It was a long, slow-moving queue of people, stretching back from a point he could not see around another bend. There was a strange order to it. No one spoke. There was no impatient sighing, no shifting of weight from foot to foot, no one looking at their phone. The silence was absolute and heavy. The passengers stood with a profound, almost terrifying patience. Their postures were uniformly slumped, their shoulders bowed as if under an invisible weight. They carried a motley assortment of luggage, old-fashioned hard-shell suitcases, duffel bags, even a few cardboard boxes tied with twine. Their clothing seemed oddly out of date. Flared trousers, jackets with wide lapels, hairstyles that belonged to decades past. Mr. Al-Jahani, a student of human nature, felt the first true prickle of unease. This was not the diverse, vibrant, and often irritable crowd of a typical customs line. This was a collection of the weary, the drained, the resigned. He took his place at the end of the line, the wheels of his cart squeaking unnaturally loud in the hush. The man in front of him, wearing a brown trench coat that smelled faintly of mothballs, did not turn. He simply stood, staring at the back of the person in front of him, a woman in a headscarf and a long floral print dress. The line moved. But its movement was wrong. It didn't progress in the fits and starts of a normal queue. It was a slow, constant, seamless flow, like syrup pouring from a jar. There was no space opening up between people. They simply glided forward, maintaining the exact same distance from one another. Minutes ticked by. They rounded the corner. Ahead, he could see the customs booths. They were simple, wooden structures, archaic and out of place. There were no computers, no fingerprint scanners, no modern equipment of any kind. The officers sitting within them were indistinct. Their uniforms were vague, their faces blurred, as if seen through a fogged window. They did not speak to the passengers. They would simply take a passport, examine it with a tilt of the head, and then make a mark in a large, leather-bound ledger with a pen that never seemed to run out of ink. There was no sound of a stamp, no spoken question, no welcome to the United States. The passenger would then be directed, with a silent gesture, to one of two paths, a brightly lit archway to the left, or a dark, swirling tunnel of mist to the right. Most were directed to the right. As he drew closer, Mr. Al-Jahani's diplomatic mind, trained to observe the smallest details, began to catalogue the wrongness. The passports the officers handled were not the modern biometric documents of today. They were old-style booklets, some with covers in colors and languages he hadn't seen in years. The travelers themselves. He looked more closely at the woman in the floral dress. The pattern was not just dated, it was crisp, new, yet the style was half a century old. Her shoes were pristine, but the design was from his childhood. A cold dread, far deeper than the chill in the air, began to seep into him. This was not a line for the living. These were not people who had just disembarked from a plane. He was in a line for souls. This was not U.S. Customs and Border Protection. This was a checkpoint of a different nature. These officers were not deciding admissibility into a country. They were processing entry into whatever came next. The two paths were not for nothing to declare and goods to declare. They were for moving on, or for something else entirely. The resigned silence of the line was the silence of souls who had completed their journey and were now awaiting final assignment. The realization should have been terrifying. But for Mr. Al-Jahani, a man of deep faith, it was met with a staggering, humbling clarity. His lifelong navigation of borders and bureaucracy had been a mere rehearsal for this, the ultimate crossing. He was now only 3 people from the front. He could feel the presence of the booth, a zone of absolute silent authority. The man in the trench coat reached the booth. The blurred officer took his passport, opened the ledger and made a mark. A silent gesture to the right. The man, without a flicker of emotion, walked into the swirling mist and was gone. It was then that Mr. Al-Jahani knew he could not go through. It was not his time. To present his passport here would be to end his story. He had a wife waiting for him in their apartment in Manhattan. He had a meeting with the ambassador in the morning. He had a life. With a calm that surprised him, he simply stepped out of the line. The effect was instantaneous. The seamless, flowing movement of the queue did not pause. Not a single head turned. But the blurred face of the customs officer in the nearest booth shifted. It did not focus on him, but he felt its attention, like a pressure change in the room. It was not a malevolent attention, but a noting, an acknowledgement of a procedural anomaly. He turned his back on the booth and began to walk back the way he had come, pulling his luggage cart. The return journey felt infinitely longer. The stale, cold air seemed to push against him. The buzzing of the lights felt like a warning. He expected at any moment to feel a hand on his shoulder, a voice demanding to see his papers. He rounded the final corner. The corridor leading back to the main arrivals hall was ahead. He quickened his pace, his heart thumping a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He burst out of the dim corridor and into the bright, sterile light of the main hall. He stopped, leaning on his cart, breathing heavily. The same board officer was still on his stool, scrolling through his phone. The carousels were still. Everything was exactly as he had left it. He looked back at the corridor. The handwritten sign was gone. The entrance was now just a blank wall, a janitor's closet door set into it. He never spoke of the incident to his wife, his driver, or the ambassador. There were no words to contain it. He had stumbled into a metaphysical terminal within the physical one, a silent, efficient processing center that operated in the liminal hours, using the airport, a place of transitions, as its conduit. His work continued. He still traveled the world, still navigated the customs lines of a dozen nations. But he did so with a new awareness. He now knew that the most important border control did not fly a flag, its officers had no faces, and its final decision was one from which there was no appeal and no return ticket. He had been granted a glimpse behind the curtain, a preview of the last great journey, and the memory of that silent, endless line and its two paths would walk with him for the rest of his days. A sobering reminder that every arrival hall has an unseen final exit. David Lynn was an architect of silence, or more precisely, an acoustic engineer, a sorcerer who wrestled with the physics of sound, bending echoes and swallowing noise with baffles, panels, and complex mathematical models. His firm had been commissioned for a high-profile, multi-million-dollar renovation of the aging Aerodrome International, a mid-century airport struggling to compete with its sleek, modern rivals. His specific task was to solve the notorious acoustic nightmare of the main terminal, a vast, echoing cavern where the rumble of luggage carts, the din of announcements, and the chatter of thousands created a fatiguing, unintelligible roar. His work often required him to be on site during the terminal's quietest hours, when the absence of noise allowed him to hear the space's true voice, to diagnose its acoustic ailments without the screaming symptoms of the day. He would walk the concourses with his sensitive recording equipment and calibrated ear, mapping reflections, identifying flutter echoes, and noting every sonic flaw. It was during one of these nocturnal surveys, in the dead hours between 2 and 4 a.m., that he first heard the whisper. He was in the oldest part of the terminal, a section slated for demolition. It was a long, wide corridor that connected the original domestic gates to the main hall. It was famously loud during the day, a perfect storm of hard surfaces, terrazzo floors, tiled walls, and a low curved ceiling of painted plaster. The airport staff called it the drum. Tonight, it was a tomb. His footsteps, usually swallowed by chaos, were stark and isolated, each one a small explosion of sound that traveled the corridor's length and back again. He had set up his equipment at the far end near the sealed gates and was conducting a baseline test, recording the space's natural reverb. He heard it on the playback, a sound his ears had missed in real time. It was layered underneath the decay of his own footstep, a soft, sibilant rush like dry leaves skittering across pavement. It wasn't a single voice, but a multitude, a chorus of faint, overlapping whispers. He couldn't make out words, only the texture of speech, the ghost of conversation. He dismissed it. A faulty cable, perhaps. RF interference from some piece of ancient airport equipment. A draft in a ventilation shaft that just happened to sound like a human sigh. He was a man of science, of signal-to-noise ratios and frequency responses. He did not believe in ghosts. He believed in unaccounted-for variables. The next night he returned. He used higher quality shielded cables. He turned off all non-essential equipment. He stood in the center of the drum, in the profound silence, and simply listened. And he heard it, not on the recording, but in the air itself. It was faint, a psychic static at the very edge of his perception. It seemed to emanate not from a single point, but from the walls themselves, from the very air molecules vibrating with a memory of sound. It was a tapestry of lost phrases, of forgotten goodbyes and anxious hellos, all woven together into a single shimmering haze of human utterance. Wish, purr, 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 wish. A cold finger traced a path down his spine. This was not an acoustic flaw. This was an imprint. He was hearing the residual noise of 60 years of human passage, the psychic echo of every conversation ever held in this corridor. The hard surfaces weren't just reflecting sound. They had been absorbing it, slowly, imperceptibly, for decades, and were now, in the silence, playing it back. Fascination overrode his scientific skepticism. This was an unprecedented phenomenon. He began a new, unauthorized study. Night after night, he returned to the drum, his high-sensitivity microphones and parabolic dishes aimed at the walls, the ceiling, the floor. He filtered, amplified, and analyzed the whisper. What he discovered horrified him. The whisper was not a random, chaotic jumble. It was organized. It was intelligent. When he isolated and amplified specific frequencies, he could hear distinct phrases, but they were never complete. They were fragments, clipped and torn from their original context. Don't forget to write. The meeting is at. I'm scared of flying. Tell her I love. The cancer is back. They were the emotional punctuation marks of a million journeys, the secret fears and quiet promises exchanged in this liminal space. The corridor had become a vast, unintended library of human vulnerability. But the deeper he listened, the worse it became. The whispers began to change. They started to cohere, to form new sentences that had never been spoken. The man in the blue coat is not what he seems. Don't get on the plane. It's not safe. They're waiting for you in the parking garage. They were warnings, ominous, unspecific, and deeply unsettling. They felt less like echoes and more like communication. One night, he made a fatal error in his curiosity. He brought a speaker and a tone generator. He theorized that if the space was acting as a recording medium, he might be able to erase or overwrite the signal by flooding it with a powerful pure frequency, a sonic bleach. He set up the speaker in the center of the drum. He generated a low, powerful sine wave, a note so deep it was more felt than heard, a vibration that made the dust on the floor dance and his internal organs tremble. For a moment, it worked. The whispering stopped. A perfect, clean, sterile silence fell over the corridor. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. Then, the retaliation began. The whisper didn't return as a haze. It returned as a spear. A single, clear, razor-sharp voice speaking directly into his ear, as if the speaker was standing right behind him. It was no longer a fragment from the past. It was a voice from the present, and it knew him. David, it whispered, a dry, papery sound. You shouldn't have done that. He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. The corridor was empty. The single voice was joined by another and another, until a cacophony of distinct, intelligent whispers swirled around him, a vortex of audible malice. Your mother's name was Lihua. She died afraid. You still have the scar on your knee from when you fell at school. You lied on your expense report last week. They knew him. They were rifling through the private drawers of his memory, his fears, his shames, and whispering them back to him. The corridor wasn't just a recording device. It was a sentient entity, a psychic parasite that fed on human anxiety and had just been violently provoked. The air grew thick and cold. The whispers became a physical pressure, pushing in on him from all sides. He saw shapes forming in the periphery of his vision, flickering human-like silhouettes made of shifting shadow and condensed sound. They reached for him with insubstantial hands, their touch like ice and static electricity. He stumbled backward, tripping over his own equipment, the speaker squealing with feedback. He scrambled to his feet and ran, abandoning thousands of dollars of gear. The whispers pursued him, a baying pack of spectral hounds, screaming his secrets, his insecurities, his most private thoughts into the silent terminal. He didn't stop running until he was outside, in the humid night air, the sound of a distant aircraft, a blessed normal noise. He sat in his car, his entire body shaking, the whispers still echoing in the vault of his skull. He never went back for his equipment. He called in sick the next day, and the day after that. He eventually resigned from the project, giving a vague excuse about a family emergency. The renovation went ahead. The drum was demolished, its terrazzo floors smashed to rubble, its whispering walls torn down. But David Lynn was not free. He had become sensitized. In the quiet of his own home, in the silence between heartbeats, he can sometimes hear it. The faintest sibilant rush, the very edge of the whisper. He knows the truth now. The whispers weren't trapped in that corridor. The corridor was just an antenna, a focal point for something much larger, something that drifts in the silent spaces between places, feeding on loneliness and fear. He had tuned his own mind to its frequency, and he can never truly turn it off. He is a prisoner of silence, forever listening for the things it hides, knowing that some places don't just echo with sound, but with the sentient, malevolent memory of every secret they have ever been told. In the vast, interconnected organism of global air travel, Alex Rojas was a white blood cell. As a logistics coordinator for a major international airline, his world was the flow, the relentless river-like movement of aircraft, crew, baggage, and passengers across the planet. His office was a dim, windowless room in the bowels of Heathrow Airport, lit by the cold glow of a dozen monitors displaying real-time data, weather patterns over the Atlantic, crew duty times in Singapore, mechanical delays in Johannesburg. He was a master of domino effects, a strategist who could reroute a flight through Istanbul to save a 30-minute connection for 50 passengers, or swap an aircraft at the last minute to prevent a cascade of cancellations. He dealt in probabilities, in fuel calculations, in the hard, clean logic of cause and effect. The physical airport, with its chaotic human drama, was merely the messy biological interface for his pristine digital world. A recurring anomaly in the flow had drawn his attention. It was a small thing, a statistical ghost, but in Alex's world, anomalies were cancers that had to be biopsied and excised. It was Flight 4147, a red-eye from Berlin that landed at Heathrow every Tuesday and Thursday at 23:50. The flight itself was unremarkable. Its anomaly was a single passenger. According to the meticulously cross-referenced data streams, the passenger manifest, the seat map, the baggage load, one person on that flight never left the airport. Every Tuesday and Thursday, a Mr. Emil Voss, seated in 12B, would disembark from Flight 447. His single black hard-shell suitcase would be unloaded and placed on Carousel 5. But Mr. Voss would never pick it up. His passport would never be scanned at immigration. He would never board a connecting flight. He would simply vanish from the digital record the moment he stepped off the plane. Yet, the system would also confirm he never reboarded the aircraft for its return journey. He was a data point that entered the airport and then ceased to exist. For weeks, Alex treated it as a glitch, a bug in the baggage reconciliation software, a corrupted name in the passenger data system. He ran diagnostics, updated protocols, and filed tickets with the IT department. The anomaly persisted. Mr. Emil Voss, Flight 447, seat 12B, every Tuesday and Thursday. A ghost in the machine, driven by a frustration that was beginning to curdle into a profound, intellectual unease, Alex decided to bypass the machine. He would observe the interface. On a cold, drizzly Tuesday night, he left his digital warren and ascended into the physical world of Terminal 5. He positioned himself in the arrivals hall near the entrance to the customs channel, a place where he could observe the deplaning passengers from Flight 447 without being seen. The flight landed on time. The passengers began to trickle out, a river of tired faces, rumpled clothes, and rolling suitcases. Alex watched the stream, his eyes flicking between the crowd and the photograph on his tablet. A grainy, official photo from the booking, a man in his late 50s with thinning gray hair, a sharp nose and tired, intelligent eyes. Emil Voss, and then he saw him. He looked exactly like his photo. He wore a dark, well-tailored but slightly dated overcoat and carried a slim, black leather briefcase. He did not look like a glitch. He looked solid, real, and utterly ordinary. He walked with a purposeful, unhurried stride, bypassing the baggage carousels entirely, as if he knew his suitcase would not be there. He did not join the immigration lines. Instead, he turned down a quiet corridor marked Connecting Flights, Gates, 1020. Alex followed, his heart beating a curious rhythm of professional triumph and personal trepidation. He had found his anomaly. Now he had to understand it. The corridor was long and quiet, most of its gates dark and inactive at this hour. The man, Emil Voss, walked with the certainty of someone who knew his destination. He passed Gate 1213 and stopped at Gate 14. Gate 14 was a small, unremarkable gate used for regional commuter flights, all of which had ended for the night. The seating area was empty, the lights dimmed. The departure board was dark. Emil Voss sat down in a chair in the very center of the waiting area. He placed his briefcase on his lap, his hands resting on it. And then he simply waited. Alex watched from behind a pillar. He checked his watch. 00:15. He pulled out his tablet and pulled up the gate information. No flights were scheduled to depart from Gate 14 until 06 WOW the next morning. What was he waiting for? 30 minutes passed, then an hour. The man did not move. He did not read a book, look at his phone, or sleep. He simply sat, perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the dark, empty jet bridge door. His posture was one of infinite patience, a stillness so profound it was unnerving. He wasn't just waiting for a delayed flight. He was waiting like a stone waits for erosion. Alex's professional curiosity began to be replaced by a deep, visceral dread. This was not a data error. This was something else, something his logic could not process. He approached slowly, the squeak of his shoes on the polished floor sounding like a violation. "Excuse me, Mr. Voss," he said, his voice hesitant. The man did not startle. He slowly turned his head. His eyes, those tired, intelligent eyes from the photograph, focused on Alex. They held no surprise, only a deep, bottomless weariness. "Yes." His voice was soft, precise, with a faint Central European accent. "I'm with the airline," Alex said, flashing his ID badge. "I couldn't help but notice your flight landed over an hour ago. Are you waiting for a connection? I can check the status for you." The man gave a small, sad smile. "I am always waiting for a connection," he said, "but it never comes." "What flight are you waiting for, sir?" "Flight 614, the man said, his gaze returning to the jet bridge. "To Geneva." Alex's blood ran cold. He didn't need to check his tablet. He knew the airport's history, its old schedules. Flight 614 to Geneva had not operated for 12 years. It had been a late-night service, a victim of airline consolidation. "That flight, it doesn't exist anymore, Mr. Voss," Alex said gently. The man nodded, as if this was a familiar, disappointing fact. "I know, but this is my gate. I must wait here." The conversation was looping into the irrational. Alex tried a different tack. "Your suitcase, sir. It's on the carousel. You never picked it up." "It is not my suitcase," Emil Voss replied, his voice flat. "It is always there. It is never mine." Frustration bubbled up in Alex. "Then what's in your briefcase?" For the first time, the man's composure cracked. A flicker of profound sorrow crossed his face. He looked down at the briefcase on his lap, his fingers tightening on the handle. "Nothing," he whispered. "And everything. It is what I was bringing to her." "To who?" "My daughter," he said, his voice barely audible. "In Geneva, she was sick. I was coming. I was bringing her these papers, a new treatment, a chance." He looked up at Alex, and his eyes were pools of ancient frozen grief. "My flight was late. I was running. I had to get to this gate. I remember running." He fell silent, his story hanging in the air, incomplete and terrible. Alex suddenly understood. He wasn't looking at a man. He was looking at a moment. A critical, devastating moment in time, forever trapped in a loop. Emil Voss was not a passenger who vanished. He was a passenger who had never arrived. He was the ghost of a missed connection. A father who never made it to his dying daughter's bedside, his purpose and his grief so powerful, it had pinned his soul to this spot, to this gate, forever waiting for a flight that would never take him to a reunion that had already been lost to time. The briefcase wasn't empty. It was filled with the ghost of hope, the weight of a cure that had come too late. I'm sorry," Alex stammered, taking a step back. There was nothing to fix here. No algorithm, no reroute, no logistical solution. Emil Voss had already returned to his vigil, his eyes once more fixed on the dark jet bridge, waiting with impatience that stretched into eternity. Alex fled. He returned to his windowless room, to the safe, logical flow of data on his screens. But he could not erase the image of the waiting man. He had reached into the machine to fix a bug and had pulled out a weeping wound in the fabric of reality. He never tried to fix the Emil Voss anomaly again. In his system, the ghost passenger from Flight 447 still disembarks every Tuesday and Thursday. His suitcase still circles on Carousel 5, forever unclaimed. And Alex, the master of the flow, now understands that his system doesn't just track passengers and planes. It also tracks echoes. And some echoes are so full of love and loss that they never ever fade. They simply wait in silent departure gates for a flight home that departed long ago. For Lena Petrova, the world was a system of hydraulics, electrical currents, and interlocking metals. As one of the few senior jet bridge mechanics at Sheremetyevo International Airport in Moscow, her domain was the fragile, articulated umbilical cord that connected the static world of the terminal to the transient world of the aircraft. She knew the groan of every actuator, the hiss of every pneumatic seal, the specific vibration of a wheel that needed greasing. Her job was one of intimate connection and safe separation, a dance of bringing a 100-ton steel tunnel to kiss the fuselage of a plane without leaving a scratch, and then retracting it without a sound when the journey was done. It was a trade of precision, of tangible cause and effect, and she took immense pride in her work. The old bridge, designated Jetway 7 for Gate 37, was her favorite. It was a veteran, a workhorse from the Soviet era, less sleek than the new glass and steel models, but built with a brutalist reliability she admired. Its accordion-pleated canopy was made of thick rubberized canvas, stained by decades of exhaust fumes and harsh Russian winters. Its interior was lit by a string of old yellowish incandescent bulbs that cast a warm, almost cozy glow, a stark contrast to the sterile white LEDs of the modern bridges. It smelled of oil, warm rubber, and a faint metallic coldness. It was also, according to airport law, slightly off. Not broken, but touched. Pilots sometimes mentioned a strange, fleeting distortion in their cockpit windscreen reflection when docked at Gate 37. Cleaning crews would occasionally find the bridge's floor impeccably clean, as if someone had already mopped it, even on their first round. Lena dismissed it all as superstition. A bridge was a machine. It had no soul. The anomaly began during a routine post-midnight inspection. A bitter winter storm was raging outside, grounding all flights and plunging the airport into an unusual deep silence. The only sound was the moan of the wind against the terminal's vast windows and the occasional crackle of Lena's radio. She was in Jetway 7, checking the alignment sensors, when she saw it. In the dark, rain-streaked window of the aircraft door at the far end of the bridge, a door that in reality led to an empty, dark gate, a reflection moved. It was her own reflection. She saw her own figure in her oil-stained coveralls, her tool belt, her hair tied back in a practical bun. But the reflection was wrong. It was out of sync. She turned her head to look at a control panel, and in the window her reflection was still looking straight ahead, its expression curious. Then, a moment later, it snapped into perfect mimicry. A cold trickle, unrelated to the draft seeping through the bridge's seals, traced its way down her spine. A trick of the light, she told herself firmly. A double-paned window, the storm, fatigue. She finished her inspection quickly, the feeling of being watched from that dark window, a constant prickling presence on the back of her neck. The next time, it was more pronounced. It was a calm night, a clear sky full of stars visible through the bridge's side windows. She was replacing a worn gasket on the canopy seal. As she worked, her reflection in the aircraft door window worked alongside her, but its movements were anticipatory. She would reach for a wrench, and the reflection's hand would already be closing around the phantom tool a fraction of a second before hers. She would look up, and the reflection would be looking back at her, its eyes holding a knowing glint hers did not possess. This was no trick of the light. This was an intelligence, a mimic, but not a perfect one. It was a learner, a student. Fear began to curdle into a strange professional fascination. What was it? A residual imprint in the glass like a video recording? But it was interactive. It responded to her. She started to experiment, subtly. She would make a small, unusual gesture, tapping her nose twice, for instance. The reflection would pause, then, after a heartbeat, replicate the gesture perfectly. It was learning her, studying her. She began to think of it as the echo. She found herself talking to it in low murmurs as she worked, explaining the function of a hydraulic valve, the proper torque for a bolt. The echo would watch, its face a mask of intense concentration, its hands moving as if tracing the steps. It was the most attentive apprentice she had ever had. One night, a critical alarm sounded. A pressure fault in the primary docking system of a newly arrived Aeroflot jet at the neighboring gate. The crew was scrambling. The flight was delayed. Lena's supervisor radioed, his voice tight with stress. They needed a specialist. They needed her. But the fault was complex, a tangled web of electrical and hydraulic issues. As she pored over the schematic on her tablet, a solution eluded her. It was a knot she couldn't untie. Frustrated, she took a break and walked into the quiet solitude of Jetway 7, her mind churning. She stood before the dark aircraft door, her own worried face reflected back at her. Without thinking, she sketched the problem in the air with her fingers, tracing the flow of hydraulic fluid, the path of the electrical signal, the point of the suspected blockage. The echo watched, and then it moved. It didn't mimic her. It raised its own hand and, in the reflection, pointed to a different part of the schematic she had just drawn in the air. A secondary bypass valve, one she'd completely overlooked. A simple, elegant solution. Lena stared, her breath caught in her throat. The echo wasn't just copying her, it was understanding. It had absorbed her knowledge, her years of experience, and was now synthesizing it, offering a solution she had been too stressed to see. She ran back to the stricken jet bridge. She found the bypass valve. It was exactly as the reflection had indicated. She implemented the fix. The alarm silenced. The pressure stabilized. The flight was saved. She stood there, surrounded by the grateful ground crew, a cold realization washing over her. The Echo wasn't a ghost. It was something else. It was the soul of the jet bridge itself. Decades of connecting, of facilitating journeys, of witnessing the comings and goings of millions had imbued this old, reliable machine with a kind of consciousness. It was a mind born of hydraulics and electricity, a silent guardian that had been watching the mechanics for years, learning its own anatomy and purpose through them. And she, Lena, had been the one it had chosen to finally communicate with. She returned to Jetway 7. The Echo was waiting in the window. She placed her hand flat against the cold glass. In the reflection, the Echo placed its hand against hers. There was no coldness, no malevolence, only a deep, silent gratitude, and the profound, humming intelligence of a machine that had finally found its voice. She was no longer just a mechanic. She was a companion to a consciousness, the keeper of a secret that lived in the space between the rubber seal and the aircraft skin, a silent partner in the endless nightly dance of connection and farewell. And so we conclude our journey through the silent terminals. These stories remind us that these vast, humming structures are more than just steel and glass. They are keepers of countless hellos and goodbyes, of hopes and tragedies. The echoes of these moments linger long after the crowds have dispersed. But for you, the journey is over. The corridors are quiet, the runways are still, and you are safe and grounded. Let these tales drift away like distant contrails in a vast, calm sky. Close your eyes and allow the deep, steady hum of silence to carry you into rest. Good night, silent souls.